you advance if the culture of the organization is not receptive to data. You will have reams of it, and it will sit in a corner somewhere collecting dust, and at the end of the year, someone will ask you, why did we make this investment, whether it be a client or internal. There's a great book. It's called Competing on Analytics. It came out in 2007. There have been a couple of articles published on it in Harvard Business Review. I think they're doing a refresh because 2007, so decades ago. But it talks about the importance of culture. It talks about sort of 5 key stages from being very data nascent to being competing on analytics. And I would highly recommend anyone who's looking to put a toe in the water to focus on that, to give it a read. The third, and the name again? Oh, it's Competing on Analytics. Competing on Analytics, yes. And it'll pop immediately up on Google search. They really optimized for it. But it's a really good read. There's another book. It's just Business Analytics. I think it's really basic. But again, there are a couple of models or frameworks for a way to think about how do you present to an organization, your senior leadership, the type of cultural structure that they need to build. And that can be a really quick use. So I would reference that book and definitely pick it up. Myth number 3 that we've heard a lot, big data is the new oil. It's going to be this engine that drives our business. It's amazing and all things great. I like this statement because it is both myth and reality. At the end of the day, in many respects, big data can function like the new oil. It can be an economic engine. But similar to oil, in its crude form, it is not that valuable. So you need to be thinking about not just big data, but the big talent, the big minds, to Aaron's point, the data scientist gap that exists, or the analytic talent gap that exists, that you need to surround the data, that you need to work with the data and to mine it in order for it to be useful. So yes, there's tremendous amount of potential in data, but left unlocked, left in crude form, it is not going to be valuable to you. So you need to balance that expectation. Just having it's not enough. This is one of my favorites, which is, get a data scientist, get in the data game. I mean, yes, Harvard came out and a bunch of others saying, this is the sexiest job of the 21st century. Data scientists, Nate Silvers from the election. Couldn't talk enough about them. Data scientists are important, but I think what we have to think about is that is one function that needs to be part of a broader analytics system. In order for the data scientist to be successful, one of the things that we've talked a lot about at Weber is the need to have actually a planner. Because the data scientists, depending on how you hire and staff for it, they have a tremendous amount of technical skill, statistical knowledge, they understand programming, hacker mentality, all of those definitions of a data scientist. Sometimes what they lack, though, is the business perspective. And that's where a planner comes in, who understands the client need, understands the critical question, and can create that roadmap for the data scientist to follow. Otherwise, I've seen data scientists, and it's not to be disparaging, but sometimes can just get lost in the amazingness of the data. And you come back 2 weeks later and you're like, have you solved my problem? And they're still like, but I found all these great data points. You need someone who can provide the map. The other thing that you need is people that understand sort of technology, that can build the hardware, think about the software, and put the systems in place for a data scientist to be successful. What are the different tools that need to be on their computers, the databases, making sure they're functioning, understand lag times and analytic times to make them meaningful. So really think about it as sort of a 3-legged stool. Data scientists, yes, critically important, but you need a planner or brand strategist that's working with them to create the roadmap, and you need someone with a facility or a tech team, IT, that can make sure that they have the tools to do the job that you're asking them to do. And many organizations are, in fact, not as well set up with the hardware and software to really do that. Getting into the game with market research, I was always nervous about this one because my roots are actually in market research, because I started my career at Roper, which was then GfK, a lot of survey research, and it was great. I was very comforted when I started having conversations with people like Joel Rubinson, who's the former head of research for the ARF, and he sort of echoed my thinking or reinforced it, which is that market research in this space struggles a bit. So something about getting to the next phase of data for your organization is you're probably going to have to think about some different partners. Traditional market research firms, and I'm defining that more as firms that are focused on things like survey research, traditional qualitative like focus groups that the communications industry has relied on quite heavily to this point, are probably not the best suited to help you navigate big data because they're used to working in structured data sets. And so they, as an industry, and again, there are definitely companies that are more sophisticated in breaking through in this area, but broadly, the industry has come out with articles and commentary that basically acknowledges that they're a bit behind in really helping their clients to achieve great value in unstructured data, massive data sets. So it's just a different sensibility about data. And so again, begin to think differently about the types of organizations that you can partner with to break into the game. The traditional partners might not be as helpful to you. There we go. Okay, bigger data equals better data. No, bigger data, very short, is just you can get lost in it. You can make a lot of unnecessary investment in things that aren't useful. Really think about valuable data, meaningful data, useful data. Think of the question first, not the volume of the data sets that you have. That's, I think the strongest recommendation to take away from this talk today. Big data equals big returns. That's the other thing that I love too, because it's tied to that idea that it's going to be an economic engine, and the more data you have, the better off you'll be. Look at Netflix, they're breaking through, et cetera, or Google for that matter. Not true. For most organizations, what they will experience is some initial upsides to investments in data, and then what they will experience is some very steep diminishing returns for a number of reasons. One, they buy more data than they have actual staff and human resources to analyze. So you invest a lot in the hard pieces, but not actually in the intelligence or the insight component of this to make sense of the data. And I would say that's the biggest factor that drives to those diminishing returns. So when you think about the race to get more data and assets, you have to think about it in parallel paths. Do I have the resources and the human talent to analyze it? If you don't, you may want to, think about holding off on those investments until you're really set up to maximize the value. But it does not automatically lead to big returns. Sometimes it can lead to big losses, big confusion, big time waste. And number 8, you need complex algorithms and predictive analytics. All of that is great. It is. But I would argue that more than all of this, the same way that an organization needs a culture more than it actually needs massive data sets to be successful, what you really need to think about is not the volume of data or the complexity of the formulas that you'll come up with. You need to think about the idea of being data-driven. You need to think about, again, those critical questions. And there's actually been research that says not the most analytic or the companies that have the most, highest volumes of data are most successful. It is merely companies that have a cultural mindset that says we are data-driven, which means we use whatever data is available to us to make the best business decisions that we can. That is what leads to a 5 to 6% increase in profitability and also productivity relative to the competition. So it's not the volume of data, it's not the complex algorithms. You can do a lot with, I think, what Erin mentioned, which is, use your eyes, look for patterns. Don't overcomplicate it in the beginning. You can always get more sophisticated, but go simple, think about your questions, and just think about a commitment to having just data-informed decision-making. And this is just a step back on a couple of ways to very quickly go into that as you're getting started, that big data conversation, to put a finer point on clarity. It's not big, well, biggest part of it. That's the volume, that's your data size. But you have to think about 4 other key factors that define what big data really means. It's the velocity. That's also what's really changed for most of us, the speed at which the data is coming in and that we have to make sense of it. The variety. The idea of producing a model is not because you have a lot of data that is one type. It's not going to work. You need to have multiple data streams, a lot of variety in your data sets in order to build models to begin with. And I think to Erin's point earlier, PR has a role to be a stronger voice in pushing for PR data to be part of the conversation, because it's another point. It's another part of the stream. It adds to the variety and the perspective. Then there's the veracity. We automatically assume that because we have data, it equals truth. There's a lot of uncertainty in data, and the bulk of what data scientists do actually is just data hygiene, cleaning, getting all the data to speak the same language. So you have to be careful to make sure that you have high volume but also high quality in your data set. And ultimately it's value. Having a lot of data that's not helping to drive the business is not going to help you. And there's been a lot of research that's been done similar to that, 4%, no one's really using data well. For multiple reasons, there's almost somewhat of a data backlash, because many organizations are beginning to feel like we've made all of these investments and I'm not seeing it move the needle. So ultimately you have to think about what is the value and the potential return of feeding this data into the stream and having to analyze it.
All right, so a couple top tips just to leave you with. It was great hearing Allison go through so many of those great points. Just a couple to highlight from what she was talking about and from what I was. So my thinking is you really need to get closer to the things that your clients care about and you want to achieve. So data if you're looking at that, you're going to want to measure the things that matter. So if you're trying to drive pull-through, positive sentiment towards your client, if you want to dominate the conversation, then make sure you're measuring that. You need to go beyond just the surface level and get to those things that really are outcome focused. The closer you can get to those outcomes, the more tangible you can make it. Just in conversations with many CEOs and CMOs, that's what's going to be the most compelling at the end of the day. Small victories lead to larger successes. Start small, prove the value of the data that you have, and then use it as an opportunity to grow in the organization. Think of it as a beachhead. Allison talked about this a bit as well, is really have those little victories because it's going to build on itself. Finally, measure the right things, not just many things. I know there's an appeal, and you read these things about seeing if traffic flows are correlating against the weather and bird migration patterns. Make sure you're measuring things that actually are going to be tied back to a thoughtful question that's going to help you or help your client, depending on the side you're on, make a better business decision in the end.
Great. So I would say in terms of top tips, really strive for fluency. Having credibility in the room when you're dealing with either multiple agency partners on the client side or actually having broader conversations within your own organization specific to data really requires that people immediately feel that you have knowledge of the space because of how you present yourself in the conversation around data. So that idea of fluency, as I mentioned earlier, there are a number of places you can go to kind of round out your understanding of the space and get more sophisticated in that area. Free tools or free access, Coursera. There's AMAC as organizations, there's IPR as organizations, PRSA is also very committed in this space to driving an understanding of the data, measurement, and analytics conversation. And also, if you're on the client side, look for potentially agency partners that may be helping to contribute to those conversations. For example, Weber, we've partnered with a data scientist, and we host regular events around data science. Break down the data silos, which is really look outside of your track, of your space, and try to see are there other people that I can look to that can add to and round out the thinking around my data set. Experimentation is key. Try something new, either as an organization or find your client allies that would be interested in pushing a little bit farther than where you've been. That's key to data as well. Acknowledge that it's both a science and an art, which I think sometimes we get caught up in like it's too analytical, it's too high science. There is a lot of art to data analysis and to reaching the conclusions, to Aaron's point, that are really about meaningful insights. That's a creative process. Remember that being data-driven drives success, not big data. And finally, that being data-driven is a process. It's a journey. And I think it goes back to the first point. Really just start on your journey, if you're at the very beginning stages, to develop that fluency to be able to talk about data and analytics across multiple audiences.
Well, this is, I think, hopefully been very helpful for everyone, and I'd ask people to share their feedback, around that. And just a couple things that I would add before we go to questions. We have some audience questions, and that we'd like to put to both of you. The notes that I've been taking away is, what is big data? Big data in the most traditional sense is, these very large data sets, which may or may not be helpful to your business question at hand. So first, just find out if you're really having a big data conversation or just having an analytic conversation to understand how do I use whatever data that I have, be it big data or other data, to drive a business result. And so in the strictest sense, if you think of that, the measurement of what we do in PR and communications is not necessarily big data, right? But it is absolutely valuable data. And that's the conversation you want to be having with internally with your management, or if you're an agency talking about if we're really serious about understanding the ROI and want the C-suite to appreciate what we're doing, is that we need to have something, which is my second point, that you've got to be part of the conversation. So again, starting small is important, but you have to start. And if you don't have anything to feed into the model, guess what happens? You're not part of the input, so you're sure as heck are not going to be part of the output. you are not going to be the person who's being on that top of the list of showing the value of what you in the communication space are driving. So having data that can feed into whatever model is going on is critical, and really thinking about that. And I think having that conversation is very important, because when we have done it, I think both, Aaron can attest to this, Allison can attest to this, I can attest to this from having done many, many years of modeling for clients and looking at ROI, that when we do include PR communications, it almost always shows quite an impact in terms of driving an outcome, right? To the extent that you can get, the media to talk about you, that you can get individuals to talk and be ambassadors, et cetera, about you, that absolutely, has value, and that's been shown again and again. So it's really don't be afraid of it. Don't be afraid that if we don't put it in, man, I might not like what comes out of it. Have a little trust in what you're doing. Understand that if that this is what you're doing is important, and that it will play out in the end. But we do have to start by having something to feed into the conversation. And if we don't, then it's, as I said, it's going to be hard to be part of the conversation. And again, the getting started is again, have something that you focus on a test, focus on an area, and just to highlight what Allison said before. It's not just about there's so much that goes into making sure the data is clean, right? That the data talks to each other, but that's it's like the plumber part of it. But what's really part of it is, are we asking the right business questions, and do I have the right data to answer that business question? That is what really we want to always be asking internally in whatever conversation. I think as whatever consultancy role we're playing in that conversation, just to keep asking those questions and making sure that your data science team is doing all of that.
I just had one point, Jenny. You mentioned the idea that sometimes we're afraid of the answers. I think traditionally, because of how I would say most commonly see measurement used, it is about proving your success. I think the first thing we have to get over to be successful in big data, it's not about proving that I did what I said I was going to do, which is kind of where measurement tends to fall in the bucket. We really have to break from that habit. This is about informing the work. This is about optimization. We really need to change the language that we use as an industry around analytics, because if you go into a room and you say, you didn't hit the mark, but these are all of the things we've learned, and this is how we will do it better going forward, I found that you will get the respect of your clients, because you haven't waited until the end of the program to say we didn't hit it. You're talking about this conversation, a couple of weeks in, a quarter in, when there's still budget and time to right the ship. So I think that's how we have to think about analytics, not measuring success, but figuring out how do we optimize the work that we're doing. And once we begin to get over that fear, I think that's also one of the first steps.
That's a great point, and that it's allowing you, it's giving you the tools to make better decisions that the C-suite's going to respect. Aaron, can you give us an example, no names or anything, but maybe a sector only, of maybe where your intuition would have told you that the PR, the function or the impact of the communications role and what had been done in terms of building the brand was important, but you really couldn't show that because there wasn't any data to help support that?
It's certainly tougher to do when we think about the B2B space. We're dealing with more scarce data there. It's not that we know it doesn't matter. In fact, I'm quite convinced it does. But that's the case where, unfortunately, you need to make a few more leaps at times. You need to try to look at things that really move, for me, further away from big data and more towards trying to work off of case studies and history to try to prove out what's going to happen there, because you're going to have a handful of data points when we started to do this sort of activity at analogs in the industry. Here's what happened. That's something I think that would come to mind for me.
So we can measure the impact of comms in any, right, to understand if there is message pull through, et cetera, but you're finding in B2B you don't always get that kind of data.
Depends on the quality of the data you're going to have access to from the client, how granular it can be, over what sort of points in time, number of touch points, things along those lines.
Allison, you had mentioned earlier that some of the sectors that are good for starting out. Is there any difference if you do focus specifically from like the agency side or people who are kind of want to understand the role of PR, because a lot of people on this call are from that space, does that change in any way the sectors you think are the right fit?
No, actually I was thinking of sectors that sort of tend to be the best at sort of gathering data. I think usually where there's an opportunity is saying, okay, you have vast amounts of data, how can we help you stitch it together? I would say that probably more than a sector is identifying clients that have sort of a sensibility and an interest, and I think that can cross any sector. And again, it doesn't necessarily have to be big data. It can be clients that are using the standard traditional structured data of brand trackers, but how can you better align that with your PR activity? So the clients that are most open to have a conversation with you are most open to investigating more within their organization, that are going to work with you to try to get access to more data so you can see how things fit together. I would say regardless of sector, those are probably someone that you would want to view as a partner and be open to experimentation.
Here's a question that we got from Viginish. Apologies if I haven't pronounced correctly, but in your experience, and I guess this go for both of you, how open are they if the data challenges and their knowledge of the market and brand work? That he's read that 70% of executives still go based on their gut and experience, even if the data says otherwise. I think we've kind of covered that in saying that you just need to find, if that's who they are, then you need to find that out first. And guess what? That's not the right place to have that conversation. So don't talk to your client about a big data or an analytic, because it's really not going to go there. So I think we kind of have covered that.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, just to echo a point that Allison had made before, I love the engineering clients because they're usually the right types.
Yes. And what advice do you have for handling PR around big data? This is interesting. This is a very different twist to address the concerns, and this is around like what you mentioned, that like it or not, Big Brother is here, and we've all kind of given permission to Big Brother to do a lot of it for every app you download and agree to the permissions. But from a PR communications perspective, clients were worried about that, like worried about what happened with Target when it came out, that story about how they used analytics to know if a woman was pregnant or not, and then there was an interesting consequence.
That's its own, or the loss of like credit card information and identity, that's an issue.
Target again.
Target. But basically, I think what we've done at Weber is we've made a concerted effort to work with our legal team to get an understanding of what's the nature of the conversation, where can we push or not, do we have the appropriate opt-ins when we're putting out programs that are going to be capturing certain types of data.
Checklist. Make sure that's a really good point.
And if you're not at a large agency like Weber, we have some internal resources, even asking your clients, so sort of what legal parameters do you have in place, or even just posing the question, have you had a conversation with legal about this, can be helpful to avoid some potential red flags. It's never going to be perfect, but they can definitely provide some guidance that can put some protections around where can you go within the data space, and if you choose to go down this path, what protections do you need to have in place in terms of privacy and the types of information that you can either capture or release publicly.
Yep, that's very important. I think we also will be sending out to everyone a summary of the event as well as a list of resources. So in that list of resources, we will include the articles that we have mentioned today, some of the courses that AMIC provides, and others. So there was a question around, are there some low-cost ways you can? Allison touched on that. We'll actually pull, that we're happy to pull together a few of those resources and send that out around to everyone, so you can do that. In terms of, we have, I think, time for just one more question. Someone was saying, asking, is there shortcut KPIs or measurements that we could start focusing in on, and that are the biggest indicators of how the business is going? And I think if we knew that, we would all not be here doing this webinar, because we would have made our millions already. So, but I still think it's one we always get, and we can spend a minute or two before we finish up.
I think the challenge with that question is the idea of sort of the shortcut KPIs. Really the purpose of, or the benefit of big data is to try to identify many, many signals to really understand the environment and ladder up to a strategic insight. If you only are focusing on a short list of key performance indicators, you're probably going to miss opportunities to optimize the work. So I would say start with the question, pull in the data sets that are going to answer the critical question, and always start with what are the objectives? What are we trying to achieve with this? That guide your KPIs. So it's very difficult for us to give you a list absent the objective, but there are a couple of resources, again, we can share them from AMAC that have things like valid metrics framework, where if you can think about what the business challenges that you're trying to solve for with communication, it provides sort of a roadmap for different types of metrics that you can use to prove along the way, outcome, end outcome metrics as well as interim metrics, but that's a hard question to unpack in a few minutes.
But Amex, that valid metrics framework is a great start. Aaron, your thoughts?
Yeah, I would actually really have to echo the point that Allison made. Ultimately, there are no shortcuts in life, as we know. Every client has a different goal, but typically if you're going to keep your eye on the prize, which for so many of my clients at least, though it may not be for yours, comes down to be the shareholder value, profit, revenue, and focus there, and then work your way backwards. That's the road to finding what those KPIs are.
Excellent. Well, let me take a moment to thank so much for both Aaron and Allison's time. You guys have been great. I think we have all taken away some key points on how to get started on this, and we will share around to everyone on the call the resources and a write-up around this. And I want to thank everyone who did join us today. It was a pleasure being with you. Thank you.